There is a village at the bottom of a long hill that most maps have forgotten by now, and perhaps that is for the best. The people of Carrow's End have always preferred to be left to themselves, to their seasons and their soil, to the smell of wood smoke curling above crooked chimneys in the gray mornings of November, to the low sound of the church bell on Sundays that carries all the way to the outlying farms when the air is still enough to carry anything at all. They are the kind of people who measure time in harvests rather than in calendars, who know their neighbors' heartaches the way they know the turns in the road to the market square. Because in a village that's small, the road and the heartache are often the very same path. And so when Edmund Whitmore died on the last Tuesday of October, and the whole village knew it before the church clock had struck noon. If this story is already warming your heart, please hit the like button and subscribe to Village Heart, and drop a comment below telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love knowing our little village reaches so far. The news moved the way news always moves in small places, not in announcements, not in headlines, but in the particular silence that falls over a post office when the postmistress stops sorting letters and simply looks up. In the way two women paused outside the baker's window that morning without speaking and then nodded at each other slowly, the way you nod when something you have long expected has finally arrived. In the way old Henry Barrow, who farmed the South Field and had farmed it since before most living people could remember, stopped his cart in the middle of Carrow's Lane, removed his hat, held it against his chest for a long moment, and then put it back on and drove the rest of the way home without a word. Edmund Whitmore was 73 years old when he died, and he had owned most of the land surrounding Carrow's End for the last 4 decades. Not all of it. A man like Edmund was careful never to own all of something, because owning everything in a place makes you responsible for everything that goes wrong in it. And Edmund Whitmore had not become wealthy by accepting unnecessary responsibilities. But he owned enough. He owned the mill property and the eastern pastures, and the 12 tenant farms that spread across the valley in a patchwork of wheat and barley and early potatoes. He owned the rights to the water that ran down from the hill. And he owned the timber on the North Ridge, and he had lived for the last 7 years of his life almost entirely alone. Not alone in the way that poets mean when they write about solitude, not the peaceful, chosen kind, with its wood smoke and its bird song and its books left open on the windowsill. Edmund Whitmore's aloneness was the other kind, the kind that arrives slowly, like damp in a wall, invisible until the damage is already done. It was the aloneness of a man whose wife had died 12 years earlier, and whose children had built their lives at a distance comfortable enough that visiting required planning. And planning, it turned out, was always subject to cancellation. He had 2 children. Lawrence, his son, was 41 years old and lived in the city. A thin, well-dressed man with the kind of face that was always slightly impatient, as though the world were perpetually running behind schedule. He telephoned his father on Christmas and on Edmund's birthday, and those calls lasted no longer than 7 minutes, because that was approximately how long it took to satisfy the obligation of having called without having to say anything of actual substance. He had not visited Carrow's End in 3 years. His daughter Caroline was 37 and lived farther still, in a coastal town where her husband worked in finance. She sent cards at the holidays, the expensive kind, with long printed messages inside that she had not written herself. She had visited twice in 5 years. Both times she had commented that the farmhouse was too cold, and both times she had left before the weekend was finished. There was also Edmund's nephew, Philip, who managed the estate accounts from a town 30 miles away, and who drove out once a month to go over the ledgers. Philip was dutiful the way a well-wound clock is dutiful, reliably mechanical, never warm. He would sit across the desk from his uncle. They would review the numbers in turn, and then Philip would get back in his car and drive the 30 miles home. And Edmund would sit in the kitchen, listening to the sound of the engine fading down the hill until it was swallowed by the valley, and there was nothing left but the ticking of the clock on the mantle and the occasional sound of the wind finding the gap under the back door that he had been meaning to fix since spring. He had grown quieter in his last years. The housekeeper, a sensible woman named Mrs. Dallow, who came 3 days a week, said that by the end he sometimes went from Tuesday to Friday without speaking to another living soul. She would find him in his chair by the window when she arrived on Tuesday mornings, looking out at the valley in the way a man looks at something he is trying to memorize before it is taken from him. He wasn't sad exactly, she would say afterward, when people asked, and he wasn't bitter. He was just waiting, like a clock that's still keeping perfect time, but nobody's looking at it anymore. What Mrs. Dallow did not know, what none of the adults in Carrow's End knew, because neither party had thought to mention it, was that for the last 14 months of Edmund Whitmore's life, he had not been entirely alone. But that part of the story belongs to Caleb Marsh. And for Caleb's story to make any sense at all, you need to understand first what it meant to be poor in Carrow's End, in the particular way the Marsh family was poor. Not the grinding poverty of having nothing. The Marshes had a roof over their heads, a small kitchen garden, and a rented farmhouse on the western edge of Edmund Whitmore's land. Agnes Marsh, Caleb's mother, was 34 years old and had the particular dignity of a woman who has refused, despite considerable provocation, to stop standing up straight. She had been a widow since Caleb was 4. Her husband Thomas had died of a fever that the local doctor said should not have taken a man his age, which was the kind of thing doctors said when they had no better explanation, and the family could not afford a second opinion. Since then, Agnes had worked. She took in mending from the neighboring farms. She helped at the harvest when her back allowed it. She sold eggs when the hens were cooperative and vegetables when the garden permitted. She did all of this without complaint and without asking for help, because she had been raised by a mother who believed that asking for help was the last resort of a person who had exhausted every other available option. And Agnes had not yet, in her own estimation, exhausted every other option. She was still looking for the next one, but the rent was 3 months behind. This was the fact that lived at the center of everything that autumn. The fact that Agnes thought about in the dark hours when the house went still and the wind came off the north ridge. The fact that sat across the kitchen table from her at breakfast like an uninvited guest she could not ask to leave. Philip Whitmore had sent 2 letters, both of them courteous in the way that formal threats are courteous when the writer has access to lawyers. The third letter, Agnes suspected, would be different in tone. Caleb Marsh was 11 years old, and he knew about the rent, the way children in struggling families always know about the things their parents most want to protect them from. Not from being told, but from the texture of the silences, from the way his mother's hands went still when she was reading correspondence, from the way she sometimes smiled at him with her mouth, but not quite with her eyes. He was a serious child, thin and dark-haired, with his father's wide forehead and his mother's habit of watching people carefully before he decided to speak. He had a gift for words. His teacher, old Mr. Fenwick, might had told Agnes once that Caleb read better than any child he had taught in 30 years, which was either the highest praise he had ever offered or a gentle commentary on the state of schooling in Carrow's End, depending on how you heard it. Caleb read everything he could find. The lending library in the next town, 4 miles away, knew his name. He did not have many friends his own age, not because he was unkind. He was not unkind, but because something in his nature inclined him toward the company of older people, toward conversations that went somewhere rather than turning in circles, toward the particular pleasure of sitting in comfortable silence with someone who did not feel the need to fill it with noise. This, as much as anything else, explained what had happened with Edmund Whitmore. It had begun simply, the way the most consequential things usually begin, with no fanfare, no warning, nothing to suggest that a particular afternoon would turn out to be the kind that shapes the rest of a life. It was a September evening, 14 months before Edmund died. Caleb had been cutting across the eastern meadow, taking the short route home from the library as he often did, because 4 miles feels considerably shorter when you have a book in your hands and a story already running in your head. He had stopped at the stone wall at the edge of the meadow to retie his boot, and when he looked up, he had seen the old man sitting in the garden on the other side. Edmund Whitmore was seated in a wooden chair that someone, Mrs. Dallow probably, had set out on the flagstone path beside the rose beds. He was wrapped in a heavy coat despite the mildness of the evening and looking at nothing in particular. At the field, at the fading light, at the quality of an October sky that has already started thinking about winter. He had the look of a very old thing that has been left outside too long, worn and patient and slightly apart from the world moving on around it. He was also, Caleb noticed, holding a book upside down. Caleb Marsh had been reading since he was 4 years old, and an upside-down book was simply not something he could pass without comment. "That book's upside down," he said. Edmund Whitmore turned his head slowly. He looked at the boy on the other side of the stone wall. He looked at the book in his hands. He turned it the right way, inspected it for a moment with complete composure, and then looked back at Caleb with an expression that was approximately 3 parts dignity and 1 part something else, some small interior movement that had not had anywhere to go for a long time. "I was aware," Edmund said. "I find it a useful test." "A test of what?" "Whether anyone is paying attention." He studied Caleb for a moment. "You were." Caleb did not know what to say to that, so he said nothing, which turned out to be exactly the right answer, because Edmund Whitmore, after a lifetime of people saying things that weren't worth saying, had developed a deep appreciation for the kind of person who could hold a silence without fidgeting. "What are you reading?" the old man asked. Caleb held up his library book, a collection of accounts about explorers, which he had already read twice and was reading a third time because some books get better with each pass, the way certain roads reveal things you missed the first time, only when the light falls differently. Edmund looked at the cover. Then he said, in the tone of a man who is not accustomed to making invitations but has decided on this occasion to make one, "Come through the gate if you like. Mrs. Dallow left too much tea." And that was how it had started. Caleb went through the gate. He sat in the other wooden chair. He drank the tea, which was strong and slightly cold, and he talked to Edmund Whitmore about explorers. And Edmund talked to him about places he had traveled to in his younger years. Places that sounded invented, but were entirely real. The afternoon light went from gold to gray. Throw in the first evening star appeared above the north ridge. And when Caleb finally stood to go home, he said almost without meaning to, "I could come back tomorrow if you'd like." Edmund looked at the star for a moment. "Thursday," he said. "Come on Thursday. I may have found a better book by then." Caleb came on Thursday, and the Thursday after that, and then most days because the walk home from the library passed the stone wall in any case, and because Edmund Whitmore, once you got past the wall he had built around himself over 7 years of being overlooked, turned out to be worth knowing. They played chess. Edmund taught him the game, and Caleb learned quickly, and within 6 weeks Edmund had to actually concentrate to beat him, which the old man said was the finest compliment he had paid anyone in a decade. When they read aloud to each other, Edmund would take a passage, and then Caleb would take one, and Edmund would correct Caleb's emphasis with the quiet precision of a man who had thought carefully about language for many years. They talked about the farm, about history, about the questions that have no clean answers but are worth sitting with anyway. Why certain birds migrate and others stay. What it meant to own a piece of land versus to belong to it. Whether a person could be homesick for a place they had never actually left. Edmund never once spoke down to him, never once softened a word or simplified an idea because he was addressing a child. He spoke to Caleb the way he would have spoken to a peer, which was, as Caleb would understand much later, or the greatest respect one person can offer another, to assume that what they think is worth the effort of honesty. And Caleb, for his part, never treated Edmund as anything other than a person, not a rich man, not a landlord, not the owner of the fields his mother worked. When the old man's hands shook too badly to move the chess pieces, Caleb moved them for him without making anything of it. When Edmund's cough worsened in October, Caleb brought him a small jar of the honey his mother kept on the shelf above the stove, the jar she saved for winter illnesses, the one she would have used herself, not because anyone had asked him to, but because it was there, and the man needed it. He never told his mother about the visits, not because he thought she would forbid them, but because there was something about the arrangement that felt private in a way that deserved protecting, the way certain friendships do. And Edmund told no one, not Mrs. Dallow, not Philip, certainly not Lawrence or Caroline, because he had reached the age at which he guarded what mattered to him carefully, having learned through long experience that the people closest to him were quite capable of taking anything he valued openly and turning it into something else. No one in Carrow's End knew any of this on the morning Edmund Whitmore was buried, and this is what made what happened at the funeral the most startling thing any of them had witnessed in living memory. The funeral was held on a Saturday, the earliest that Lawrence and Caroline could arrange to travel, and which happened to suit Philip as well, was since he had prior commitments during the week. Mrs. Dallow had overseen the laying out of food in the main house. There was a tradition in Carrow's End of providing a meal after a burying, and she had maintained it even under the circumstances. Cold meats and fresh baked bread and a fruit cake on the long table in Edmund's dining room, which had not seen a proper gathering since his wife's time. The villagers came, as villagers do, because Edmund Whitmore had been part of the landscape of their lives, whether they had particularly liked him or not. And because in small places, the dead are honored not only for who they were, but for what they represented: continuity, memory, the particular weight of time passing. Old Henry Barrow sat in the third pew. Mr. Fenwick, the schoolteacher, held his hat on his knee throughout the service. The postmistress sat near the back. The Carrow's End people filled their accustomed places and grieved in their accustomed way, quietly and without performance. Lawrence stood at the front of the church in a charcoal suit that had been pressed recently and carefully. He shook hands and accepted condolences with the practiced gravity of a man who has attended many formal events and understands how to position himself correctly in them. He spoke warmly about his father to the vicar and smiled at the appropriate moments. Caroline wept during the service, quietly at intervals that seemed timed, and afterward composed herself efficiently and accepted comfort with the resigned grace of a woman who had in some private and interior way been preparing for this particular day for some time. Philip stood slightly apart, as he always stood, making mental notes. None of them noticed the boy who had slipped in through the side gate of the churchyard and was standing at the edge of the gathering outside the church, watching. Caleb had not been invited to the funeral. There was no reason he should have been. He was a tenant farmer's child, 11 years old, from a household that owed rent money to the very estate now being mourned. No one in the Whitmore family had any reason to know his name. He had come because Edmund was dead, and he had not found anywhere else to put that fact. He had carried it all week, from the moment his mother had passed it to him carefully across the supper table on Tuesday evening, and sitting with it inside the farmhouse had not been enough. He needed to be near it, near whatever of Edmund remained in the world. He had not eaten since morning. There was bread in the farmhouse, but his mother had been keeping it carefully, rationing it the way she rationed everything this autumn, making it last. He had not asked for any. He was very hungry by the time the gathering moved from the churchyard to the Whitmore house, and it was hunger as much as grief that brought him through the gate behind the last of the departing mourners. The dining room was warm and full, the smell of cold meat and fresh bread, and something sweet beneath it all. The fruit cake, he thought, reached him the moment he crossed the threshold, and it was almost painful in the way that good smells are painful when you have been without them. Caleb stood near the door and watched people fill their plates and gather in small clusters, talking in the lowered voices that funerals produce. And he studied Lawrence and Caroline from a careful distance, trying to reconcile the people moving through Edmund's house with the people Edmund had described to him. The children he had watched grow up in this very place, who had become strangers to him so gradually he had not understood it was happening until it was already done. He was still standing near the door, trying to make himself as small and unnoticeable as possible, when one of the servers passed with a tray of bread rolls, and Caleb, without thinking it through completely, reached out and touched the woman's sleeve. "Excuse me," he said, his voice very quiet. "Could I have one of those? But please." She was a woman Caleb did not recognize, brought in from outside the village for the occasion, and she glanced at him with the uncertain expression of someone not sure whether to respond or to find someone else to respond for her. She never had the chance to decide either way. "Who let this child in?" The voice came from across the room, and it was Lawrence Whitmore's voice. Not raised, not cruel in any obvious theatrical way, but carrying the particular edge of a man who considers himself responsible for the proper order of things and has encountered a disruption. He was looking at Caleb with the blank, rapid assessment of someone who has not yet classified what he is looking at, but has already concluded it does not belong. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something has happened that everyone recognizes, but no one is ready to name. Caleb stood where he was, his hands still near the tray, and felt the heat rise into his face the way it always did when he found himself suddenly visible somewhere he had not intended to be visible. "I'm sorry," he said. "I knew Mr. Whitmore. I only wanted—" "You knew my father." Lawrence repeated it the way you repeat something said in a foreign language, to make clear that you are not certain you have heard it correctly. "Yes, sir." "And your name?" "Caleb Marsh. My mother rents the West Farmhouse." The West Farmhouse." Philip's voice came from somewhere to the left, with the flat precision of a man for whom the West Farmhouse existed primarily as a figure on a ledger. The figure being, now at this particular moment, 3 months of unpaid rent. "Agnes Marsh's boy." Something shifted in the room's temperature. Not dramatically, just perceptibly, the way water changes before a storm. "Well," Lawrence said, and his voice had settled into something smooth and final, the voice of a man closing a door politely but firmly. "This is a private family gathering. I'm sure you understand." Caleb understood. He understood it exactly and completely. He also understood that he was 11 years old and had not eaten since morning and had not slept properly since Tuesday, when the shape of the world had changed without warning in a way he had not been equipped to handle, because Edmund Whitmore was dead, and there was no one he could say that to out loud, no one in the whole of Carrow's End who would understand what that meant or what it cost to hear it. He said none of this. He said, "Yes, sir," and turned toward the door. He was nearly through it when Caroline's voice came from behind him, lighter than her brother's, more practiced in a different register of social management. "Is this the sort of child who appears at funerals looking for food? Someone ought to speak to his mother." It was not by any measure the worst thing said in that room that day. It would not even rank among the most memorable by the standards of what was still to come. But to Caleb Marsh, walking back out through the gate into the cold October air with his hands at his sides and his face still burning, it sat in his chest alongside the grief that had no name yet. Alongside the memory of a wooden chair on a flagstone path and a book held upside down and a voice saying, with complete sincerity, "You were paying attention." He walked home along the hill road. The wind had come around from the north. He walked with his head down and his hands in his coat pockets, and he did not look back. He was halfway up the hill when he heard the footsteps behind him. He turned. It was Mr. Selden. Arthur Selden, the solicitor, who had handled Edmund Whitmore's affairs for 22 years. A small gray-haired man with ink-stained fingers and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead in the permanent manner of someone who is always in the middle of important work. He was breathing hard from the effort of the hill, but his eyes, when he reached Caleb, were clear and deliberate. "Caleb Marsh," he said. Caleb waited. Mr. Selden straightened his coat against the wind and looked at the boy for a long moment. The particular look of a man who knows something the other person does not yet and is deciding carefully how much to say before the proper time. "I need to speak with your mother," he said. "I need you both to come to the Whitmore house tomorrow morning. 9 o'clock. "Why?" Caleb asked. "Because Edmund Whitmore asked me to," Mr. Selden said, "and because what he left behind will need to be explained in front of the family." He paused. "He left specific instructions about you." Then he turned and walked back down the hill toward the Whitmore house, and Caleb stood alone on the road, with the wind finding every gap in his coat, and tried to understand what had just been said to him. He could not yet. But he walked the rest of the way home with something that was not quite hope and not quite fear, but lived precisely in the space between them. He told his mother what Mr. Selden had said, and Agnes Marsh sat down at the kitchen table and was quiet for a long while. "Specific instructions," she said at last. "About me," said Caleb. Agnes looked at her son, at his wide, serious forehead, at his careful, watching eyes. She did not ask him how he had come to be the subject of a wealthy man's specific instructions, because she had raised this child and she knew him, and she understood, without needing the details, that Caleb was the kind of person who warranted things being written down, the kind of person who inspired that particular care in others. "We'll go in the morning," she said quietly. She made him tea, and she gave him the last of the bread, and she sat across the table from him in the lamplight while the wind came off the north ridge, and neither of them slept very much at all. The morning came in gray and cold, the way October mornings do in the valley when the season has stopped pretending to be anything other than what it is. Agnes Marsh was up before the light. Caleb heard her moving through the kitchen below his room, the quiet, deliberate sounds of a woman who has been woken not by the dawn, but by everything that preceded it. He dressed carefully in the clothes she had laid out for him the night before, his good trousers, which were too short now, and she had let out the hem twice already, his white shirt washed and pressed, his coat, which was warm enough but had a fraying cuff she had not been able to repair, because the thread she needed was the kind of thread that cost money. When he came downstairs, she was sitting at the kitchen table, with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, looking at nothing in particular. She had done her hair in the way she kept for important occasions, pinned back neatly at the nape, nothing loose or uncertain. She was wearing her dark dress. She looked, Caleb thought, exactly like what she was. A woman who intends to be taken seriously and knows she will have to work for it. She looked up when he came in and studied him for a moment with the quiet thoroughness of a mother checking that her child is properly assembled before something that matters. "Eat something first, Chiquan," she said. "Itwar, I'm not hungry." She set a piece of bread in front of him without further comment. He ate it. They did not speak much. There was not, in truth, very much to say. They were both carrying the same uncertainty, the same careful, slightly frightened hope, and talking about it would not have made it any more manageable. At 20 minutes to 9, they walked down the hill together into the village. The Whitmore house sat at the western edge of Carrow's End proper, past the church and the green and the row of cottages that formed the spine of the village. It was a stone house of considerable age and some dignity, not a mansion, not the kind of house that announces itself, but the kind that has been inhabited by serious people for several generations and has absorbed something of their gravity. The garden had gone to seed in recent years. And Edmund had not been up to managing it, and there was no one whose job it was. The rose beds that had framed the flagstone path where Caleb had first seen him from the far side of the wall were brown stem now, the last of the year's color long gone. The gate was open. Mr. Selden's car was already in the lane outside. Another car beside it, Lawrence's, Caleb supposed, recognizing nothing about it, except that it was the sort of car that cost more than his mother made in a year. And behind both of them, Philip's modest gray saloon, exactly the kind of car Philip would drive. Agnes put her hand on Caleb's shoulder as they reached the door, not stopping him, not reassuring him exactly. Just a brief, grounding pressure. Then she knocked. Mrs. Dallow opened the door. She looked at Agnes with professional composure, Aaron, and then looked at Caleb. And her face did something small and almost imperceptible, a slight softening around the eyes that was gone before it could be named. "They're in the sitting room," she said. "Mr. Selden asked me to show you in when you arrived." The sitting room of the Whitmore house was a room Caleb had never entered through the front. He had always come through the garden gate, always through the side, always into the kitchen or the study where the chessboard lived on its shelf and the books were stacked on every surface because Edmund had outgrown the bookcase years ago and never got around to acquiring a second one. The sitting room was formal in the way of rooms that are kept for occasions. A fireplace with a clean grate, a sofa in dark green fabric that still held its shape, and armchairs arranged in a careful geometry that suggested consultation rather than comfort. Lawrence was standing by the fireplace. He was in the same charcoal suit as the previous day, or one very like it. He looked, in the daylight of the sitting room, older than he had in the church. There were shadows under his eyes that spoke of a poor night, and his expression had the tightly managed quality of a man who has been rehearsing composure since before breakfast. Carolyn was seated on the sofa. She was dressed in black again, though less formally than the day before, and she held a small leather clutch bag on her lap with both hands, in the manner of a person who needs something to hold. When Caleb and Agnes entered behind Mrs. Dallow, she looked at Caleb the way you look at something unexpected. Not with recognition, but because she had barely registered him the previous afternoon, only as a disruption to be managed. But something in the way he walked into the room, straight-backed, quiet, not apologizing for being present, seemed to require a second look. Philip sat near the window with a notepad on his knee. He did not look up immediately. Mr. Selden stood near the writing desk that Edmund had used for his accounts, a heavy oak desk that had been Edmund's father's and his grandfather's before that. On the desk was a document in a cream-colored folder. Mr. Selden had his reading glasses on and his hands folded in front of him. "Good morning," he said, and his voice was the voice of a man in complete command of the room, not through forcefulness, but through the quiet authority of someone who knows precisely what he is holding and what it means. "Hey, please come in. Thank you for coming, Mrs. Marsh." "Mr. Selden," Agnes said. Lawrence's gaze had moved to Caleb with the fixed precision of a man trying to understand why a child he had sent away from his father's funeral was now standing in his father's sitting room at 9 o'clock in the morning. "I wasn't aware," Lawrence said carefully, "that this meeting was open to tenants." "It is not open to tenants," Mr. Selden said, without looking up from his folder. "Mrs. Marsh and her son are here because Mr. Edmund Whitmore specifically requested their presence at the reading of his will. That request was written into my instructions and is not subject to discussion." A silence settled. Lawrence looked at Philip. Philip looked at his notepad. Caroline's eyes moved from Caleb to her brother and back again. Then she looked at Mr. Selden. "Is there something we should know before we begin?" "There is a great deal you should know," Mr. Selden said pleasantly. "That is rather the purpose of the exercise. Please sit down, everyone. Mrs. Marsh, there is a chair there, if you would." Agnes sat. Caleb stood beside her chair, and she put her hand on his arm once. briefly, then removed it. Steadiness offered and received. Mr. Selden opened the cream folder. I will read the will of Edmund Percival Whitmore, landowner of Carrow's End. In its entirety, he said, I ask that everyone present hold their questions until I have finished. Mr. Whitmore was specific about this. He wrote in his instructions that questions asked before the reading is complete will have answered themselves by the time it is finished, which was his way of telling me he anticipated interruptions and wanted them prevented. So, he looked around the room over the top of his glasses. We shall begin. The early sections moved efficiently. The legal affirmations of sound mind and full intent, the provisions for Mrs. Dallow's service and severance, a donation to the Church Restoration Fund that Mr. Fenwick had been trying to advance for the better part of a decade, a small bequest to the village lending library in the next town which was, and this produced a sound from Caleb that he quickly suppressed, earmarked specifically for the children's section. Practical things, precise things, the decisions of a man who had thought carefully about what he owned and what responsibilities came with it. Then Mr. Selden paused. He turned a page. In the remainder of the estate, he said, which comprises the eastern pastures, the 12 tenant farms including their associated rents and entitlements, the mill property, the timber rights on the North Ridge, and the contents of Edmund Whitmore's personal accounts, currently amounting to a sum he asked me to read aloud. He read the number. The room absorbed it in different ways. Lawrence's jaw moved almost imperceptibly. Philip's pen stopped on his notepad. Carolyn's hands tightened on her clutch bag. The number was, by any measure, significant. Not the extraordinary fortune of a man whose name appears on buildings and bridges, but the accumulated wealth of 4 decades of careful stewardship, the kind of money that does not announce itself but settles things permanently and completely. The remainder of the estate, Mr. Selden continued, is to be disposed of as follows. And here he paused again. It was not, Caleb would think later, a pause for effect. It was the pause of a man who has carried a document for some time and is aware that what he is about to read will change the room irrevocably, and who wants to honor that weight before proceeding. To my son Lawrence, Mr. Selden read, I leave the sum of £2,000 with the hope that it will afford him the time to consider whether the business he has spent his life building is, in fact, the life he intended to be living. He is a capable man. He might yet become a present one. Lawrence's face did not move, but something behind it shifted. The way the face of a man shifts when he has been struck somewhere that does not show. To my daughter Carolyn, Mr. Selden read, when I leave the sum of £2,000 in the portrait of her mother that hangs in the upstairs hallway, which she has admired since she was a child, and which I have therefore never moved, in the hope that she would someday come back and ask for it. She never did. I am sending it to her instead. Caroline made a sound. Not quite a word, not quite crying, the kind of sound a person makes when something finds an opening in them they had not known was undefended. To my nephew Philip, Mr. Selden continued, I leave the sum of £1,000 in recognition of his reliable service and the accurate management of my accounts over many years. Reliability is not warmth, but it is not nothing, and I have valued it accordingly. Philip wrote something on his notepad. Then he stopped writing. Then he put the pen down. Mr. And Selden turned the final page. The remainder of my estate in its entirety, the land, the properties, the accounts and investments, the house and its contents, I leave as follows. He took his glasses off. He looked at Caleb. Mr. Edmund Whitmore asked me, Mr. Selden said, speaking now not entirely in the register of legal recitation, but in something more direct, more personal, to have you read the final section yourself. He wrote it separately, in his own hand, and he asked that it be read aloud by you. He was very specific about this. He said, Mr. Selden glanced at the letter beneath the final page, and I am quoting, Caleb reads well, better than anyone I've known in years. Let him have the last word. It seems right. The room was absolutely still. Lawrence's mouth had opened slightly. Caroline had stopped making any sound at all. Mr. Selden carried the final page across the room and held it out to Caleb. Caleb looked at it. His name was at the top, in Edmund's handwriting, the handwriting he knew from the margins of borrowed books, and from the occasional note left on the chessboard when Edmund wanted to make a point about a game they'd played the previous week. Deliberate, slightly heavy-handed, the writing of a man for whom words are chosen and placed with care. He took the page. He looked at his mother once. Agnes was sitting very still, her hands folded in her lap, her face composed in the particular way she held herself when things were about to become difficult. Not braced for the worst, but not surrendered to hope either. She looked at him steadily. He looked back at the page. He drew a breath. Yes, and he began to read. If this story has found its way into your heart, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new tale from Village Heart. Your support is what keeps the fire burning and more stories like this one coming your way. To whoever is in this room when these words are read, Caleb said, and his voice was steady in the way of a child who has been reading aloud since he could first hold a book and who understands instinctively that the words on a page belong first to whoever wrote them and must be carried faithfully. I want to tell you about a September evening. He paused, not from nerves, but because that was where the pause lived, written into the sentence by a man who understood pacing. I was sitting in my garden in a wooden chair that Mrs. Dallow had set out for me, which she does without being asked because she is a better person than I have ever properly thanked her for being. I was holding a book upside down. I was not reading it. I was doing what I have been doing most evenings for the last several years, which is to say I was sitting very quietly inside a very large silence and waiting for it to stop feeling like the natural state of things. A boy came over the stone wall, or rather, a boy appeared at the stone wall, serious-faced, dark-haired, with a library book under his arm, and the look of someone who has never quite learned to walk past a thing that is wrong without mentioning it. He told me the book was upside down. I told him I was aware. He came through the gate because I asked him to, and he drank Mrs. Dallow's leftover tea and talked to me about explorers. And then I talked to him about the world before it got away from me. And when he left, he offered to come back. Not in the offhand way that people offer things they don't intend to follow through on. He said it the way people say things they mean. He came back on Thursday. He's been coming back ever since. I have been a landowner for 40 years. I have made decisions affecting the lives of people in this valley for 4 decades. I have sat across negotiating tables and signed contracts and managed the kind of numbers that ought to have made me feel substantial. And I am telling you honestly, the most consequential thing I have done in the last 3 years of my life is leave the gate open. His name is Caleb Marsh. He is 11 years old. He is the best chess player I have taught in all my years of teaching the game. And I taught his grandfather, which tells you something about blood and something about persistence. He reads the way certain people breathe, like it is simply not optional. He has never once, in 14 months of near-daily acquaintance, said a thing he did not mean. He once walked 4 miles in the rain to bring me honey for a cough that I had not told him was troubling me. He knew because he pays attention. Paying attention is his particular genius. He is also the son of Agnes Marsh, who has rented the West farmhouse for 11 years, and who is 3 months behind on rent through no fault that reflects on her character. Agnes Marsh is a woman of uncommon dignity. She has never once asked me for anything she was not owed, which in my experience is rarer than it ought to be. And I am ashamed that it took a child's friendship with me to make me see clearly what was happening on my own land. I have therefore done the following. The West farmhouse and the half-acre attached to it, I leave to Agnes Marsh outright in freehold, free of any existing debt or obligation. The 3 months of arrears are hereby canceled and are not to be pursued. She owns the house. She owns the land. No one is ever to speak to her about a lease again. The remainder of my estate, the eastern pastures, the 12 tenant farms, the mill property, the timber rights, the personal accounts, I leave in trust to Caleb Marsh to be managed on his behalf by Mr. Arthur Selden until Caleb reaches the age of 18, at which time he will assume full control. To Caleb, I say this directly, because he is in the room and this letter is being read by him, and he deserves to be addressed as a person rather than discussed as a subject. You came through the gate when I asked you to. Every time for 14 months, you came through the gate. That sounds like a small thing. It is not a small thing. It is the whole thing. I have money enough to have bought almost anything I wanted in the last 4 decades. I could not buy what you gave me, which was simply the consistent, uncomplicated decision to show up. You brought a jar of honey for my cough. You moved my chest pieces when my hands shook, and you never looked at my hands while you were doing it. You read to me on the evenings when the words went sideways and I could not follow them myself. You argued with me about history and geography and the relative merits of various explorers with the absolute confidence of someone who is quite sure that what they think is worth the effort of the argument, which it was. It always was. You asked me once what I thought was the most important thing a person could do. I said I wasn't sure. I have been thinking about the answer ever since. I think the answer is this: to see another person clearly and to choose to stay anyway. Not because it is convenient, not because there is something to be gained, but because staying is what love looks like when it has nothing left to prove. You stayed for a lonely old man on a cold evening with a book upside down and too much leftover tea. You stayed because it was the right thing to do, and because you are in the specific way that matters most. When your mother's son, I am leaving you my land and my money because I trust you with it, not because you are spectacular, though you may well turn out to be, but because you are good. And goodness, in my long experience, is the rarest and most durable foundation there is. Take care of the valley. Take care of the tenants. Take care of your mother, though I expect she will take considerable care of herself in any case. Get an education. Come back to Carrow's End when you know enough to do something useful with it. And please, for the love of everything, beat the chess record I have written out and left in the desk drawer for you, because I never did manage to record a perfect game, and it would give me considerable satisfaction to know that someone did. One more thing. There will be people in this room who are angry when they hear these words. Some of them share my blood. I want them to understand something, and I want them to understand it clearly, because I did not explain it well enough while I was living. I did not stop loving you. You are my children, and I have carried you in whatever constitutes a father's heart every day of your lives, including the days you did not call, including the days you delegated what should have been personal, including the days you were too busy to come, and then the days that ran out. I do not write this to wound you. I write it because you are intelligent people, and you are capable of understanding, if you let yourselves, what happened, and more importantly, what did not need to happen, and what it is still not too late to prevent from happening again with the people who are waiting for you right now in your own lives. The boy reading this letter came to me with nothing and gave me everything. I hope that in time you understand what I mean. And I hope it is not too late. With love as it has always been, your father, Edmund Percival Whitmore. The page came down slowly in Caleb's hands. The room was the quietest room in all of Carrow's End. Outside, a cart was moving on the lane beyond the gate. A pigeon moved on the eave above the front window. The clock on the mantelpiece was ticking. Everything was continuing exactly as it had been before, because the world does not alter itself to accommodate the moments inside it that change everything. Inside the room, no one moved. Lawrence was standing very still by the fireplace. His face had been through several expressions during the reading, and what remained now was not the expression of a man who has received a verdict. It was something more complicated than that. The face of someone who has been shown a version of themselves that they are not ready to confirm and cannot honestly deny. He looked older, standing there, than he had looked at any point since he arrived in Carrow's End. Not aged by grief exactly, aged by recognition. Caroline had stopped holding her clutch bag. It had slipped to the cushion beside her, and she had not noticed. She was looking at the place where her mother's portrait hung in the upstairs hallway, or rather, she was looking at the sitting room wall as though she could see through it to the hallway, to the portrait, as to the woman in it. She had her hand over her mouth. Philip had not written anything on his notepad since the reading of the final section had begun. He was looking at Caleb with an expression of pure, unmanufactured attention. The first unguarded look he had produced since arriving in Carrow's End. And it was, Caleb thought, the look of a man who has just understood something about himself that the numbers in his ledger had not prepared him for. Mrs. Dallow, who had been standing in the doorway, which was not technically her place, but which Mr. Selden had graciously refrained from mentioning because he understood that she had known Edmund Whitmore for a decade and had some right to be present, was crying without making any noise about it. And in the particular way of women of a certain generation who were taught that crying in public was acceptable only if it was completely inaudible. Agnes Marsh sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the floor for a long moment. Then she looked at her son, and Caleb, holding Edmund's last words in his hands, looked back at his mother, at the dark dress and the pinned hair and the fraying cuff of the coat she had not been able to repair, at all the steadiness and all the dignity and all the quiet, relentless love that had stood between him and the worst of things since he was 4 years old. And his composure, which had held through every word of it, came undone completely and without warning, the way composure does when it is no longer needed. Well, he sat down on the floor beside her chair the way he used to sit beside her when he was very small, and she put her arm around him and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would have been better than the saying of nothing. Mr. Selden quietly closed the folder. Lawrence was the first to speak. He spoke toward the fireplace rather than to anyone in particular, in a voice that had lost all its managerial precision and had become, in spite of itself, something much less controlled. "He telephoned me," Lawrence said. "In November last year. I missed 3 of the calls and had my assistant return the others." A pause. "I didn't know." No one replied to that. "I thought—" He stopped. "I thought there would be more time." Silence. "There is never more time," Mr. Selden said, very quietly, and without any particular sharpness, simply as a fact. "That is the one thing we all know, and none of us believe until it stops being theoretical." Lawrence turned from the fireplace, and for the first time since the morning looked at Caleb directly. Looked at him with the eyes of a man who has set down a very heavy piece of equipment and is not yet sure what his hands are supposed to do now. "He told you things," Lawrence said, "about us." Caleb considered how to answer this. He remembered Edmund's voice on the evenings when his children came up in conversation. Not angry, never precisely angry, but carrying the particular weight of a man who has accepted a disappointment so thoroughly that it has become part of his structure. "He told me about when you were young," Caleb said carefully. He told me about when you learned to drive and put the car in the ditch on the east lane, and he found you trying to dig it out with a garden fork at midnight." A pause. "He thought that was funny. He still thought it was funny." Lawrence looked at the floor. "He told me Caroline argued with him about the Hartley building renovation," Caleb continued, "and he was still furious about it because he had since decided she was wrong. But he never told her that, because he also said she might not have been entirely wrong, and he wasn't ready to concede that yet. Caroline made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something that wasn't. He talked about you, Caleb said. Both of you. Not in the way people talk about something they've lost. In the way people talk about something they are still very much thinking about. Another silence, different from the ones before it, this one with less stone in it. Why didn't he tell us he was ill? Caroline asked. Her voice was small and very honest. He must have known for some time. Why didn't he tell us? Caleb thought about how to answer. He thought about Edmund on a cold February afternoon, with his coat pulled close against the kitchen cold, while Caleb made tea on the aga, the way Edmund had taught him, saying, almost to himself more than to Caleb, that there was a particular loneliness in needing something from people who found your needs inconvenient, that he had spent years learning not to be a burden and was perhaps too good at it, that the trouble with learning not to ask was that eventually the people around you forgot that you ever had anything to ask for. He didn't want to feel like an obligation, Caleb said. The room absorbed that. That is not the same as saying he didn't want you, Caleb said. He wanted you very much. He just didn't know how to want you in a way that didn't feel like asking for something he'd already been told wasn't available. Something broke in Lawrence's face. Not dramatically, just a crack, the kind that starts thin and then, given time, lets the light through. Outside, the wind had come around. It was rattling the garden gate, the one Caleb had come through for the first time on a September evening 14 months ago, the one Edmund had always left on the latch on the days he knew the boy would be coming. Something very small and very profound moved through the room at the sound of it. The ghost of an old man who had learned almost too late what the value of an open gate was. Agnes Marsh stood up. She looked at Lawrence. She looked at Caroline. She looked at each of them with the clear, unfussy directness of a woman who has spent 11 years being sensible on difficult terrain and has no interest in pretending that the present terrain is otherwise. Your father was a good man, she said. He was a lonely man, which is not the same thing, and not his fault alone. My son knew him better in 14 months than most people do in a lifetime, and that says something about both of them. She picked up her coat. I think it would be best if we gave you some time. She held out her hand to Caleb. He stood, and unfolded Edmund's letter carefully and put it in the pocket of his good coat against his chest. He stopped at the doorway. He kept a record of every chess game we ever played, Caleb said, to no one in particular and to everyone. In the desk drawer. 14 months of games, both our names, and the result. He said it was the only accurate account of anything he'd kept in years. He paused. He won most of them, but not all. Then he walked out through the front door with his mother, down the flagstone path, through the garden gate that had been left open, and out into the cold October morning, where the valley spread below Carrow's End, in all its quiet, enduring familiarity. Behind them, the house was very still, and in the sitting room, Lawrence Whitmore walked slowly to the window and stood looking out at the lane for a long time. At the stone wall, at the road that went uphill toward the western farms, at the view his father had looked at every day of his adult life from a house that had been warm once and had gone cold by degrees so gradual that no single person could be said to have let it happen. And that was the whole trouble. The clock on the mantelpiece continued to tick. Mr. Selden closed his briefcase. He left the folder on the desk, as was proper. He paused at the door and looked back at the room with the expression of a man who has delivered many wills in his career and knows that what happens in a room after the reading is, in its way, the most important part of the whole proceeding. He was very fond of the boy, Mr. Selden said to the room, or in case that needed saying. He was very fond of him, and the boy was very fond of him, and sometimes that is the most honest testimony a person leaves behind. He went out through the hall, past the portrait on the staircase, and the door closed softly behind him. In the sitting room, Caroline stood and walked to the window beside her brother. They stood without speaking for a moment, looking at the same lane, the same wall, the same gray October morning their father had looked at every day and that neither of them had particularly noticed until now. "I should have come back," she said. Lawrence did not say anything, but his hand found the ledge of the window beside hers and rested there. Outside, Caleb and Agnes walked up the hill together in the pale morning light, the letter warm in his pocket, the valley opening below them, the gate swinging on its latch behind them. Agnes walked with her head up. She was thinking about a house that was now hers, that could not be taken, that did not have a debt standing between her and the next season. She was thinking about what it meant to own the ground you stood on after 11 years of standing on it at someone else's discretion. She was thinking that she had underestimated, possibly, what an old man with a book held upside down and too much leftover tea had been doing with her son all those autumn afternoons. And Caleb walked beside her and thought about what he would do with a valley. He thought about the 12 tenant farms and the families in them, families like his own who carried the uncertainty of other people's decisions in their chests through every season. He thought about the lending library 4 miles away that now had a bequest for the children's section. He thought about Mr. Fenwick, who had spent years trying to fund a church restoration and had just received more than he'd been asking for. He thought about Edmund, who had sat in a garden chair in the fading evening light, holding a book the wrong way, waiting in a silence too long maintained for something he had not known how to ask for and had been given anyway, by a boy who had nothing to offer except the willingness to come through the gate. He thought, "I will leave the gate open." He thought, "That is where I will begin." News in a village does not travel. It seeps. It finds the gaps between things, between the post office counter and the queue behind it, between the bakery window and the bench outside it, hey, between one garden gate and the fence of the next, and it moves through them the way water moves through old stone, patient, unhurried, impossible to stop once it has begun. By noon on Sunday, Carrow's End knew. Not all of it. Not the precise figure in Edmund Whitmore's accounts, or the exact wording of what had been read aloud in the sitting room that morning, but enough, the bones of it, that the will had been read, that the boy from the West Farm had been present, that Lawrence and Carolyn Whitmore had walked out of their father's house with considerably less than they had walked in expecting, that Agnes Marsh owned her home now, free and clear, by the hand of a dead man who had apparently known more about who deserved what than anyone had given him credit for. Old Henry Barrow heard it from his wife, who had heard it from Mrs. Adallow's cousin. He sat with it through his Sunday dinner without saying a word, and when his wife asked him what he thought, he said, "I think Edmund was wiser than most people found comfortable," and went back to his meal. Mr. Fenwick heard about the library bequest before anything else, and he sat down in his kitchen chair and did not stand up again for some minutes. When his wife found him and asked if something was wrong, he said, "Nothing's wrong. I've been waiting 7 years for something like this, and I'm giving myself a moment." The restoration of the church nave had been his quiet ambition since a piece of plaster ceiling came loose during a winter service and landed in the collection plate. He would begin writing to the stonemasons on Monday. The village absorbed the news with a mixture of emotions that can only be produced by a small community sitting with a story that simultaneously surprises them and does not surprise them at all. Because on reflection, in the post office, on the green, over Sunday tea, people found that they had known something, or something like it, for quite some time, had noticed the boy cutting across the eastern meadow with a library book under his arm most evenings, had noticed the gate left on the latch on the afternoons when Edmund was well enough to sit outside. They had not asked, but they had noticed, and there were those like Henry Barrow who had known Agnes Marsh for 11 years. known her as the woman who never asked for credit at the shop, even when the alternative was going without. Known her as the woman who brought food to every household that had seen illness or loss in the last decade without ever drawing attention to the fact. These were the people who heard the Sunday news and set their cups down and said quietly and without ceremony, "Good," as though the universe had finally corrected a ledger that had been running in error for too long. By Sunday evening, word had come from Mr. Selden that new arrangements would be discussed with the 12 tenant farms the following week. Caleb had asked one question before leaving the Whitmore house that morning, standing in the cold lane with the gate still swinging behind him. "Can I talk to the families this week? Just to talk, not the legal parts. Just so they know someone is listening?" Mr. Selden had looked at him over his glasses for a moment. "Yes," he said. "Haha, I think that would be a very good thing to do." On Monday morning, Caleb borrowed his mother's good coat, his own not being quite up to the occasion, and walked the circuit of the 12 farms. He went to all of them, every one. At the Hendricks farm, the oldest working farm on the Valley Circuit, George Hendricks sat Caleb down at his kitchen table and looked at him for a long time across a mug of strong tea before saying anything. George Hendricks was 64 years old, with arms like oak branches and a face that had been outdoors for 6 decades and showed it without apology. He had spoken to Edmund Whitmore perhaps a dozen times in 25 years, all of it formal, conducted through Philip's ledger and Philip's letters. He looked at the boy sitting across his table in a coat 2 sizes too large, and he said, "Well, you're Agnes Marsh's boy." "Yes, sir." "She's a good woman, your mother." "Yes, sir." Edmund Whitmore was a fair man, George said, being precise rather than generous. Not warm, but fair. Never cheated anyone on the terms. Never put a family out in winter. He looked at Caleb steadily. "Are you going to be fair?" "Yes," Caleb said, "and I'm going to try to be warm as well." George refilled Caleb's tea without comment. They talked for an hour about the Eastfield drainage problem that had affected the Hendricks wheat yield for 3 seasons, and that Philip had received 2 written requests about and had not acted on. Caleb took out the small notebook Edmund had given him for his birthday, a good leather one, nothing flashy, and wrote it down, not as a list, as a conversation. He visited all 12 farms that day and the next. Through he wrote down what people told him, the drainage, the collapsed fence line on the north boundary, the mill bearing that needed replacing before the winter grain run. He listened in the way Edmund had taught him, without interrupting, without hurrying toward a conclusion, without offering solutions before the problem had been fully stated. On Wednesday evening, he spread the notebook on the kitchen table and went through it with his mother. Agnes had been practical about everything since Sunday morning, because practicality was her nature, and there was a great deal to be practical about. The house being hers was something she was still finding her way around the edges of, catching herself in odd moments, standing at the kitchen window with her hands still in the washing up water, just standing there, feeling the solidity of walls that belonged to no one with power over them anymore. "The drainage is most urgent," Agnes said, looking at the notebook. "I know. Mr. Selden is getting the engineer out next week. The mill bearing needs doing before the November grain. Already written to the millwright. Mr. Selden helped me with the letter." Agnes looked at her son. At the 12 farms worth of accumulated need written down in a borrowed coat over 2 gray November days. "Edmund taught you how to do this," she said. "He taught me to write things down," Caleb said. "He said the most expensive thing a landowner could do was forget what someone had told him once." Agnes was quiet for a moment. Then, "I should have thanked him." "He knew," Caleb said. "He talked about you. He said you were the kind of person who thanked people through what they did rather than what they said." A pause. "He meant it as a compliment." Something in Agnes settled then. Quietly, permanently, the way a thing settles when it is placed at last in the right position after a long time being carried. Lawrence Whitmore left Carrow's End on Monday morning. He had said very little after the reading, had eaten Mrs. Dallow's cold supper in near silence, had helped without being asked to carry boxes from his father's study, had stood in the doorway of Edmund's bedroom for a long time before he walked away and did not go back. He did not contest the will. Philip had expected a phone call from a solicitor by Sunday afternoon and had prepared several careful positions in anticipation. But Lawrence drove back to the city and no call came. What came instead, 3 weeks later, was a letter to the West farmhouse. It was not long. Lawrence was not a man who wrote long letters, but it was honest in the way of something written late at night by a person who has spent 3 weeks not writing it and has finally run out of reasons to wait. He wrote that he had found the chess game records in the desk drawer, as Caleb had said. 14 months of games, both names. The results tallied at the bottom. He had sat with the box for a long time. He had found behind the records something else. A letter Edmund had begun writing to him 3 times and had crossed out each time. About the illness, about the November phone calls, about wanting his son to visit not from obligation, but from wanting to. The letter was never finished. It ended mid-sentence, 3 times over, with the pen having stopped where the words stopped working, and better ones had not been found. Lawrence wrote that he understood now why the right words had not come. He wrote that he had mistaken, for a long time, the absence of conflict for the presence of connection, that these were not the same thing. He did not ask for anything. He did not offer anything either, which Caleb, reading the letter twice, understood to be correct. An offer at this point would have been about the person making it. The letter was about something else. At the end, Lawrence wrote, "I don't know what I'm trying to say, except that I am glad he was not alone. And I am sorry that the reason I am glad is that I was not there." Caleb wrote back. He kept it short, as Lawrence had. He told him about the chess record. He told him that Edmund had won convincingly for the first 6 months, but the record evened considerably after Christmas, and that on the final game, Caleb had won in 31 moves, and Edmund had said, with complete equanimity, that it was the most technically correct game he had ever witnessed, and that Caleb had clearly been listening, which was all he had ever asked. He wrote, "He talked about the car in the ditch every time that subject came near. His version got longer each time, and your incompetence got more spectacular. I think he was proud of it somehow. I think it was something about you being human. He liked it when people were human. He signed it. Caleb Marsh." Then below his name he added, "He kept all your letters in a box beside his bed. I thought you should know." Caroline came back in December. She came without announcement, in her own car, and went directly to Mr. Selden's office. She had a proposal she had been developing since November. An education trust in Edmund's name, covering fees for the tenant farm children through secondary school and beyond. Ensuring a child's prospects did not depend entirely on which side of whose gate they had been born on. She had money of her own and had decided she knew how to use some of it. Mr. Selden reviewed it over 2 cups of tea and told her it was solid work and that Edmund would have approved. Caroline sat with that and then said, "I'm not doing it for his approval. I'm doing it because he was right, and I've been slow about understanding that, and I'm trying to be less slow." The meeting with Caleb happened in the West farmhouse kitchen. Her Agnes made tea and found reasons to be in the other room, close enough if needed, far enough to allow it. Caroline sat across the table from a boy whose family had, until 5 weeks ago, been barely holding ground against 3 months' unpaid rent, and she said, "I was unkind to you at the funeral." "Yes," Caleb said. She had prepared for a softer answer. The plainness of it landed differently. "I am sorry for that." "I know," Caleb said. "Your father would have wanted you to say it, and I think you know that. But I also think you mean it. He looked at her steadily. So, thank you. Carolyn was quiet. Then, you're remarkably composed for 11. My mother raised me, Caleb said. She spread the trust papers on the table and explained them simply and clearly, without softening the details. Caleb read through the relevant sections and asked 3 questions, all specific. All answered well. He told her he would speak to Mr. Selden by the end of the week. She was at the door when she turned back. He was happy, she said. When you read his letter, the chess games, the explorers, was he happy? Caleb answered the way Edmund would have wanted, without rounding the corners. He was lonely for a long time, Caleb said, and then he was happy, not every day, but most of them at the end. Yes. Caroline stood at the door with her hand on the frame. Then she nodded once, the nod of a person receiving something they have needed and cannot hold steadily, but will not put down. Good, she said. That's good. She walked out into the December afternoon. Caleb turned back to her papers and read them again, more carefully, with a pen in his hand. The winter was the coldest in Carrow in a decade, which the Valley people accepted with the equanimity of those who have been managing difficult winters for as long as they can trace their line. The north field drainage was paused until spring. The mill bearing was replaced in time for the November grain run. The church nave restoration began in April, with Mr. Fenwick on site every morning inspecting the stonemason's work with a ferocity of investment they privately found both admirable and exhausting. Caleb went to school throughout all of it. The same village school, Mr. Fenwick's classroom, the same desk. But he worked now with a particular orientation, the way a compass needle orients when it is found north, as though the hours in the classroom were building towards something specific, as though he finally understood what they were for. Mr. Fenwick recommended him for a bursary at the secondary school in the next town, one of the good bursaries, the kind with real support and real expectation. He mentioned it to Agnes at the end of term and told her that in 30 years of teaching he had seen perhaps 3 children who understood, instinctively, that education was a form of service rather than a form of advancement, that Caleb was one of them. Agnes thanked him. Then she went home and stood for a moment in the spare room before coming back to the kitchen and making supper. In spring, the Education Trust was formally established. Carolyn had named it the Edward Whitmore Trust after Edmund's father, the kind of man, by all accounts, who believed in things built to last. The first cohort of beneficiaries would be selected in spring. 14 children were eligible across the 12 farms. 3 had places waiting at the secondary school, pending confirmation of funding. One of them was Caleb Marsh. He had not known this when he consulted on the trust. He had not asked. When Mr. Selden mentioned it during one of their fortnightly meetings, Caleb sat with it in silence. Then he said, "The trust isn't meant to benefit me. The estate is already providing for my education." "This is separate," Mr. Selden said. "The trust is for tenant farm children. You are a tenant farm child. You were one for 11 years. The trust makes no exceptions on the basis of changed circumstances." Caleb considered this for a moment. "Put my place to the next child on the list. I'll manage separately." "Mr." Selden looked at him over his glasses for a long time. "He really did teach you well," he said. "Yes," said Caleb. "He did." Spring came to Carrow's End the way it always does, gradually, then all at once. The north wind retreated over the ridge. The Hendricks field drainage was completed in March. The first barley rows went in on the same date as always, because George Hendricks was not a man who made unnecessary changes to a system that worked. The mill ran clean. The scaffolding on the church nave stood patient against the April sky, and the new stone was pale against the old. And Mr. Fenwick walked the perimeter of it every morning the way a man walks the perimeter of a dream that has finally, after a very long time, become a practical matter. There was one conversation that spring that Caleb would return to for many years afterward. He was walking the north boundary fence line with George Hendricks in April, assessing which posts needed replacing before the summer stock movement. They talked about the season and the drainage and the price of barley. And then, in the way conversations move when the formal business is done, George said, "My father worked this land under Edmund's father, his father under the grandfather before that. 3 generations farming ground we didn't own. Fair arrangement mostly, but there's something that lives in a man when he knows the land can be taken from him." He stopped at a post and tested it with his hand. "Your mother doesn't have that anymore." "No," Caleb said. 12 families on this valley. Most of them still do." Caleb was quiet, and he thought about something Edmund had said once, that ownership was a kind of protection you could extend or withhold, and that the extending of it, when done properly, was not a loss, but a completion. "I've been thinking about that," Caleb said. George looked at him. "Mr. Selden says I shouldn't make large decisions about the estate until I'm older. He's probably right." Caleb paused. "But I've been thinking about the direction, and I wanted you to know the direction." George walked another few paces. A blackbird moved in the hedge beside them. The valley spread below. 12 farms laid out in their patient geometry, the mill on the water, the church on the hill. "All right," George said. "Tell me." And Caleb told him. George walked the rest of the fence line without speaking. When they reached the end, he stood looking out at the valley with his hand on the last post. The April wind coming easy off the ridge. Nothing of winter left in it. Then he said, "Your grandfather would have liked you. You knew him. Before the fever. A little. He was a reader, too." George looked at the boy. He had the same way of looking at a thing, like he was working out what it owed and what it was owed. Caleb looked at the valley, at all of it. "I'll do right by it," he said. George Hendricks looked at him for a long moment, at the boy who had come through a gate left open, who had sat with a lonely old man through 14 months of evenings, who had walked 12 farms in a borrowed coat and written down what people told him, who had given back his place in an education trust without hesitating. "I know you will," George said. They walked back down together through the new green field into the village, where the smell of turned earth and fresh bread moved through the lanes the way it had moved for longer than anyone could reliably remember. There are things worth saying about what Caleb Marsh became. He stayed in Carrow's End. That is the first and most important thing. He went to the secondary school, then to university, the first from the West Farm to do so in living memory, and studied land management and economics and history in that order. Every summer he came back to the valley, sat with Mr. Selden, went over the accounts, walked the farms. He came back at 25 with a degree and proposals he had been refining for 7 years, and the 12 farms of Carrow's End over the following decade. It became something the valley people had not known to want, because they had not known it was possible. What George Hendricks had named on the fence line. The thing that lives in a man when he knows the ground can be taken. Its absence. Agnes Marsh lived in the West farmhouse for the rest of her life. She had a garden that became one of the most productive in the valley, something she attributed to the soil and that those who knew her attributed to the woman. She grew old in the house that was hers, beside the child who had grown up and come back as she had always known he would, because she had raised him and she knew his nature. She never entirely stopped taking in mending, though she had long since stopped needing to. She said she did it because she liked the work, because it was honest and it mattered and it left things better than it found them. Her kitchen lamp burned late most nights. The light of it was visible from the lane, warm and steady in the window, unchanged through the seasons. People walking home late from the village would see it and feel, without being able to say exactly why, something easeful, like a marker, like an answer to a question they had not known they were asking. The chess record stayed in the desk drawer for many years. Edmund's desk, the heavy oak one with the brass handles. Caleb had moved to the West Farmhouse study because it was, as Edmund had said, the right desk for thinking at. In the drawer, he kept 14 months of games, both names. The results tallied at the bottom in Edmund's methodical hand. He read through it many times. Not for the results, but for the occasional notation in the margins. Brief, the way Edmund was brief when he was being precise. Beside one October game, the boy sees the board differently, not better yet, but differently, which may be more important. Beside a January game, he moved my pieces today when my hands gave out. Did not make a thing of it. I don't know where he gets it. And beside the final game, the 31 move game, played 2 weeks before the end, a single line in smaller, more deliberate writing, as though the pen had been lifted between each word. He was paying attention all along. Caleb read that line on the evening he first found it. He sat with it for a long time. Then he closed the drawer and turned the lamp lower and went into the kitchen where his mother was sitting. And they talked for an hour about nothing in particular and everything that mattered, in the unhurried way of two people who have come through difficult things together and arrived in the same place, which is not the same as arriving unchanged, but is a very great deal better than the alternative. Outside, Carrow's End went quiet by degrees. The last cart on the lane, the last window going dark, the last door closing softly against the night. The church stood with its restored nave, the new stone pale against the old. The 12 farms slept in their valley places. The mill wheel was still. The north ridge was dark against the darker sky. And in the west farmhouse at the end of the lane, in the house that no one could take, in the kitchen where a jar of honey sat on the windowsill above the stove, a light burned warm and steady, just as it would burn year after year, season through season, long past the time when anyone living could say with certainty where the story had begun. They only knew how it had been told. A hungry boy came to a funeral in 2 short trousers and asked for bread and was turned away. And a dead man's words read aloud by that same boy in a room full of people who had not expected to be moved did what the best stories do. The ones told at dusk, the ones that travel the way wood smoke travels through a cold morning, slowly, surely finding every gap in the stone, carrying their warmth to the most distant places, arriving at last exactly where they were always going. Some things find their way home. They always have. Thank you for sitting with this story all the way to the end. If it moved you, and I think you'll find a home in the other videos on your screen right now. And if you haven't subscribed yet, come join us. There's always a place by the fire at Village Heart. Until next time.